Hello, friend. Don't look behind you while I'm telling you a story. Story 1. The Gatekeepers. No one remembers exactly when the house was built. It stood silently atop a red earth hill, nearly 10 kilometers through forest paths from the small town of Havenbrook. The elders in the region said the place was once an ancient burial ground for the first settlers, people who came from the distant east, bringing with them funerary rites unlike any culture known in this land. But over time, the forest consumed every trace, leaving only the moss-covered wooden house 2 stories tall, with a steep roof and a single upstairs window that remained shut like the eyelid of the dead dot in 1987. The Prescott family moved to Havenbrook. Charles Prescott, a man in his early 40s, was a high school history teacher who had recently lost his wife in a strange car accident on Highway 9. He brought with him his only daughter, Eleanor, 12-year-old girl with dark brown hair and eyes that always seemed to be focused on something no one else could see. They rented a red brick house near the old church, where the autumn wind whistled through the thin cracks in the walls, creating sounds like sighs tangled with whispered prayers. The town welcomed them with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. People spoke to Charles with a courtesy that bordered on reluctance. Other children didn't play with Eleanor. They whispered to each other that she was weird because she often stared into nothingness or drew chaotic shapes in charcoal faces without eyes. She didn't cry, didn't laugh, just drifted through her days in long dreams, where a woman in mourning robes always stood at the end of a hallway, facing away, never stepping forward, never vanishing. 3 months after they arrived, Eleanor disappeared on a moonless night. Charles said he was teaching an evening class and returned home around 9 to find his daughter's window wide open. On the floor was her gray wool blanket, the one she always slept with, soaked as if it had been submerged in a well. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no struggle, only a single folded piece of paper on her desk. It showed a pitch-black door without a handle, standing alone among trees. Police found no clues. The search lasted 2 weeks before it was called off. People said Eleanor might have been kidnapped or perhaps ran away, traumatized by her mother's death. But Charles didn't believe it. He believed Eleanor had been culled, like the ones they used to speak of, those who walked into the Havenbrook woods and never returned. Charles began losing sleep. He quit his job, avoided familiar faces, and spent hours in the town library, flipping through pages of old books about the region's history. He eventually found a handwritten account of uncertain origin, detailing a group of people from the Far East who had come to Havenbrook in the late 18th century. They hadn't stayed long, but left behind strange symbols carved into stones, what the locals called sealing marks. The last person who had lived near the hill where the abandoned house stood, an old woman named Myrna, claimed before her death that she had seen flickering lights from the second-story window, even though the house had long been deserted. Not the light of the living, she said, the light of those who cannot die. That winter, Charles disappeared. His house was found empty, paperwork still laid out on the table, the fireplace still faintly burning. Police found only one thing, a hand-drawn map leading from town to the northern hill where the nameless house still stood. Beneath the map was a line, jagged and nearly scratched in with fingernails. I can hear her voice. She isn't dead. Nearly 30 years later, in 2015, a group of archaeology students from Meriden University came to Havenbrook as part of a study on early migratory settlements. The team included 4 members, a young professor named Hannah, 2 senior students, Drew and Melissa, and a research assistant named Kellen. They set up camp at the edge of the Havenbrook woods, and after 2 weeks excavating near the hill, they uncovered a flat stone slab buried under thick moss. On the slab was a carved spiral symbol, at the center of which was an eye that had been smudged out, as if the carver had tried to erase it but hadn't dared to go all the way. Hannah began sleepwalking. She was found leaving the tent in the middle of the night, heading toward the abandoned house, though she had never been told it existed. When Drew caught up and held her back, she said only one sentence before collapsing. "The door is open." Melissa found, among Hana's notes, a mistransliterated passage in archaic Chinese that could be interpreted as, "When the eyeless ones call your name, do not answer. But if you've heard them, you've already been chosen." Drew didn't believe in any of it. He was a rational type, convinced that stress and lack of sleep were causing the group to unravel. But when Kellen hanged himself with a survey rope in front of the tent one foggy night, his face pale and rigid, eyes wide open as if witnessing something far beyond this world, Drew began to doubt when they called the police. The locals of Havenbrook only shook their heads. A thin old man with sun-spotted skin, standing outside the general store, whispered to Hannah, "You shouldn't have touched that stone. We buried it for a reason. Not everything ancient is meant to be unearthed." Drew had never believed in ghosts. He was raised in a traditional Protestant family where every explanation for strange phenomena was either psychological or, at worst, fabrication. But when he and Hannah stepped into the abandoned house to look for clues about Kellen's death, his worldview began to crack up. The house showed no signs of being ravaged by time. The wood was rotten but unbroken. The windows were dusty but sealed shut. A thin layer of moss covered the floor like the skin of someone long dead. The air smelled of dampness and old ash, a scent that burned the throat for reasons one couldn't name. Hannah walked ahead, her steps light, as if she were entering sacred ground. Drew followed with a flashlight, its beam brushing over every detail. A shattered mirror hanging on the wall reflecting their silhouettes in distorted forms. A wooden chair toppled beside a cold fireplace, and a small door at the end of the hallway. Stairs to the second floor. When Hannah touched the doorknob, Drew heard a faint sound, like a hiss from behind the wall. Not loud, but unmistakable, as if someone was whispering with a severed tongue. The door opened with no creak of hinges, only a thick darkness, still and heavy like water sealed in a tomb. They climbed the stairs. Each wooden step groaned, not under their weight, but beneath their presence. The only room on the second floor had a window. The window remained closed, but from the inside, there was a handprint on the dusty pane, small, like that of a child. Hannah approached it. She said nothing. Drew looked at her, then followed her gaze. On the floor was a circle of black charcoal, within it small stones arranged in a spiral. At the center was a gray wool blanket, frayed and decaying, but unmistakable. "Eleanor's blanket. This can't be," Drew whispered, but the words vanished into the room, creating no echo. Hannah knelt and picked up a piece of the blanket. Her fingers trembled slightly. "I've seen this. In a dream," she said. But her voice was not her own. It was as if she were repeating someone else's words. That night, Hannah didn't sleep. She sat before the carved stone slab, her eyes vacant. Drew secretly checked her old notes and found a torn page. When held under light, the ink stains were still visible. The door is not just a gate. The door is a person. The next day, Melissa vanished. No sound, no trace. In her tent, she left behind a charcoal sketch, a long-haired woman standing in the forest, arms outstretched as if waiting to be embraced. Her face had no eyes, only two hollow sockets, and blood spilled from her mouth. As if she had been smiling for too long, Hannah began murmuring in her sleep. She spoke in a language no one could understand, but Drew recorded it and sent the audio to an anthropology professor he knew. 2 days later, the professor replied with only one sentence: "That is not meant for human tongues." Then he disappeared from email, and his phone went dead. Drew decided to leave. He packed everything and dragged Hannah out of the house, ignoring her weak resistance. But as they drove past the edge of the woods, a tire exploded without reason. In the rearview mirror, Drew saw the house standing silently, as if it had moved several meters closer. Hannah opened the door and ran into the forest, calling out, "It's waiting for me. I am the chosen one." The last time Drew saw her was as her silhouette vanished behind the trees. He returned 2 days later with the police. But the house was gone. In its place was an empty patch of land, grass scorched black in a perfect circle. At the center was a shallow depression, like an unfilled grave. Inside was no body. Only a piece of the gray wool blanket and a small terracotta statue. A human figure with no eyes, hands covering its mouth, as if keeping a secret greater than life itself. In 1894, before Havenbrook had an official name, the land was merely a quiet stop in the woods for coal miners traveling from the east. Among them was a family from the Central Asian highlands. No one knew their origin. The man was known as Taif H, and the woman, always veiled in white, never let anyone see her face. They lived in isolation in a small wooden house on a red-soiled mound to the north. No one dared approach. Locals said that on nights with a pale moon, strange chants emanated from the house, spoken in a tongue that was neither Latin nor any known indigenous language. Dogs would howl as if summoned from afar. Then a child disappeared. Then a young woman. The police didn't investigate. Those who lived nearby quietly moved away. Only one written account remains. In the town preacher's journal that autumn, I came to bless the house in the north. The door would not open, but from within there was a scent like the dead but not rotting. The woman inside said, "We do not keep the dead. We keep what's left." By winter, the entire house vanished. No trace remained. Only a circular patch of earth and 12 stone pillars encircling it, each carved with a different symbol spiraling inward. The villagers called it the mouth ring. A young blacksmith named Thomas, in a drunken stupor, broke one of the pillars to use the stone for his home's foundation. 3 days later, he went mad, bashing his head into a wall until he died. His blood pooled into a spiral no one could explain. Since then, the village followed an unspoken law. No one was to set foot in the north. The story might have faded into oblivion had it not been for an Eastern scholar, a Spanish professor named Olmo Navarro, who came to Havenbrook in 1938 to study the concentric spiral mark, which he believed was the remnant of an ancient sect from Asia that had somehow reached North America in the 18th century. Navarro vanished only 2 weeks later. His final notes included a drawing of a sealed room with 6 walls, no exits, and a phrase in French. "C'est n'est pas un lieu. C'est une mémoire." This is not a place, this is a memory. Nearly a century later, Charles Prescott stumbled upon those notes while sifting through the local library's archive of antique books. From that moment, something changed in him. He became obsessed. He believed Eleanor was connected to a long-lost ritual called kimonan, opening of the door for the formless ones. In the notebook he left behind, there was a passage. Eleanor draws spirals before bed. She doesn't know why. But I do. That spiral is a symbol of Kaimon Nachbi, the ancient rite of a lost sect that used children as vessels of breath. She doesn't know she's being called back, as if the blood in her veins remembers what was once offered. Charles didn't go to the house to look for Eleanor. He went to find what Eleanor had become. In the journal found at the plot where the house once stood, his final words were, "She wasn't taken, she was chosen." And I opened the door. When Drew returned to Havenbrook a third time, he was no longer a student. He had become a survivor. He came back because he couldn't sleep. In his dreams, he saw Hannah standing in a dark room, holding the eyeless statue, her hands covering its mouth, repeating the same words. "Don't say its name. Don't say the name." At the town's small museum, he met an old woman named Grace, the 4th-generation granddaughter of Thomas, the blacksmith who broke the pillar. She lived like a recluse, but when Drew showed her the spiral drawing, her eyes widened. It's returned. 7 generations is enough. She said that since her ancestors' crime, their bloodline had been forced to remember. Every child born bore a faint spiral on their skin, and by the 7th generation, the child would disappear. Grace was the 6th. She had no children, but she could feel the spiral tightening. She said Havenbrook was not built on ordinary land. This place had once been a breath knot, a spiritual convergence point in ancient Eastern beliefs, a gathering site for the dead, where the door didn't open only one way. She handed Drew a terracotta statue identical to the one he had seen before. A figure with no eyes, hands covering its mouth. This was once a gatekeeper, she said. They gouged out their own eyes so they wouldn't be seduced by what was inside. But one of them broke the rule. And since then, the door has never closed. Asterisk, the house was gone, yet that night, Drew dreamed he was standing in front of it. Except it wasn't a dream. He could feel the cold, the scent of burnt wood, the sound of wind brushing against his back like fingers gliding along his spine. The door was open. Inside, there was nothing. No rooms, no stairs, no objects. Only a dense black void, as if something existed by not existing. From within that darkness, a voice spoke. Neither male nor female. Neither from ahead nor from inside his head. You have stepped into the spiral. Now you're the door. Drew woke in the middle of the night, his throat parched. In his hand, he didn't know when it had appeared, was the eyeless statue. He threw it to the floor, but heard no sound of breaking. When he looked down, it was gone. In his palm, a red spiral mark, like a burn, began to emerge, pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He went to see Grace. The old woman trembled as she opened the door. It's calling you now. What is? Not what, everything. It has no form. It's just the gathering of all unspoken words, all unacknowledged deaths. The door is where forgotten memories collect. And now you are the place of gathering. She spoke of the rite of the return, a ritual meant to reenact a death that was never completed. In each generation, one person is chosen to recall a grievance that was never spoken aloud. If the rite is not performed, the memory will rise through the chosen, turning them into a vessel for lost remnants. Eleanor had been chosen, but not to remember. She was chosen to keep. Grace led Drew to a small room beneath her house. Inside were 7 statues, each representing a person who had vanished in Havenbrook across generations. All were eyeless. But one statue was different. It had eyes drawn in charcoal and a mouth sewn shut with thread. This was the last one who resisted the rite, Grace whispered. She chose to keep silent, not to pass it on, and so she became trapped forever. Drew recognized the face carved into the statue. It was unmistakable. It was Hannah. He left Grace's house that night, heading north. The map in his hand needed no light. The spiral on his palm glowed faintly in the dark, guiding him. There was no house anymore. But the place was now a sunken patch of earth, shaped in a circle, the soil cold like the bones of the unburied dead dot at the center of. The circle stood a flat stone. It bore a crack, long and narrow like a mouth. Drew placed his hand upon it. A faint pull. His hand sank slowly into the stone, not painful, just cold, and then came the sensation of seeing a past that wasn't his. He saw Eleanor, small and still, sitting in a dark room. Before her was Charles, his face twisted like a man trying not to lose his mind. He repeated, "You have to hold the door. If you don't hold it, it will open and look for someone else." Eleanor cried, but her tears didn't fall to the floor. They rose into the air, soaking into the walls. Drew was pulled deeper. He saw himself in another life standing in a forest, holding the clay statue, screaming someone's name. But his mouth made no sound. And from behind, a hand touched the back of his neck. Damp, bony, it was Hannah. But not Hannah. Hannah had no eyes. Yet, she looked at him. "Stop remembering," she said. "Memory saves no one. It only hurts." "Oh, are you? I am what you forgot, what you chose not to see. But when you unearthed it, I had to return." The vision ended. Drew woke up in the middle of the earthen circle. On his chest was the statue, but now it had both eyes and a mouth. His dried blood stained his lips. Asterisk. After that night, Drew never left Havenbrook. He rented a small room near the old library, where each night he wrote down his dreams, as if, without putting them to paper, they would cling to his throat and burst into a scream. But the dreams didn't fade. They became more precise. Almost like ... memories. One evening, Grace knocked on his door. She said nothing, only handed him a photograph. An old photo, browned with age, its edges brittle. In it stood a group of 7 people gathered. Around a stone circle, hair tied back, cloaks draped, each holding clay figures identical to the ones he had seen. At the center was a man with his eyes blindfolded, a spiral drawn in blood on his forehead. The man in the middle was my great-grandfather, Grace said, and the one behind him, ... is you. Drew looked closer. There was no mistaking it. He or someone with a face exactly like his stood in the back, holding a statue, staring straight into the camera as if already aware someone in the future would look back. But strangely, ... His shadow wasn't cast on the ground. You weren't? Born to live, Grace whispered. You were born to repeat. On the 49th day since his return to Havenbrook, Drew dreamed of Eleanor. But she was no longer a child. She had grown her eyes colorless, yet not blind. She wore a gray coat standing in the forest. Behind her were faceless figures, like cutouts from a different layer of reality. You thought I was a victim? Eleanor said, but I chose this. I've been the door since birth. I was born of those who wanted the curse preserved. But a curse cannot endure unless someone wants to walk in. Drew stepped forward. And what about me? Eleanor smiled. You're the last one chosen, not to keep it, but to end it. It wasn't a plea, it was a command spoken in a gentle voice. Drew woke. On his chest was the clay figure, this time complete. Eyes open, mouth smiling, arms extended as if inviting. He returned to the circle one last time. Winter had arrived. Snow covered the stone pillars, but the central slab remained exposed. Etched on its surface was an inscription he hadn't seen before. He who holds will forget. He who opens will become. He placed the statue on the stone. Suddenly the wind ceased. Silence. Then, from deep within the earth, a sound echoed like breath passing through a hollow throat. The stone cracked open. No light emerged. Only a gash in reality, split wide. From inside, a hand reached out. Not human, not demonic, but the shape of all things forgotten. Blurred faces, unheard cries, fragments of regret with no grave to rest in. Drew didn't step back. He walked in. The door closed. No sound. No explosion. Nothing. Only the snow continued to fall. And on the stone slab, the statue was gone. 2 years later, Havenbrook became known for a strange phenomenon. No GPS could locate the town after dark. Maps vanished, signals faded, cars went astray. Those who wandered in spoke of a house without a number, deep in the woods, with a soft yellow glow in the window, though no one ever saw a front door dot in the town's library. An old notebook rests between the shelves. No one knows where it came from. The title reads The Doorkeepers on the first page in faded charcoal handwriting. I know this isn't real, but it might be. Story 2. The mask inside the coffin. No one really knows why this small suburb of Millstone in the state of Vermont has never had long-term native residents. Despite being close to the forest, with a mild climate and abundant resources, the place has always felt like it lacked something, as if the land itself didn't want anyone to stay too long. Locals still repeat an old saying, origin unknown. In Millstone, you shouldn't dig past the first layer of soil. It was a warning, but no one paid much attention. That was until the winter of 1983. That year, the real estate company, Densler, began developing the eastern edge of town to build a row of new luxury homes. They hired archaeologists to inspect the ground, ensuring no historical sites would be disturbed. After 3 weeks of test digging, they uncovered a stone coffin buried 2.7 meters deep, surrounded by scorched wooden stakes and rope braided from an unidentifiable tree bark. There was no lid, no inscription, no grave goods. Only a red wooden mask lying in the empty coffin, facing down into the soil as if it had been forced to look away. Dr. Martin Halbrook, the lead archaeologist, decided to bring the mask back to the storage room at Hartford University for study. He theorized it might be a form of funerary or demonic ritual mask, possibly connected to an extinct pre-colonial tribe. But what disturbed him most wasn't the artifact, it was how his team reacted. Within the first 3 days, 2 assistants, abruptly quit without explanation. One reported dreaming of being buried alive in the stone coffin. The other refused to give details and left behind only a hastily scribbled note. The mask is not for the living. Things might have ended, if not for a phone call from Professor Hayako Seto, a Japanese scholar specializing in forbidden rituals of ancient East Asian cultures. She had come across a photograph of the mask and immediately flew from Tokyo to Hartford. Her private meeting with Dr. Halbrook lasted exactly 42 minutes. No one else was in the room. Afterward, Halbrook stopped seeing visitors, abandoned all. Further research, and left a final recorded message on tape. We were wrong. This isn't a mask, it's a lid to a calling mouth. If it's been flipped, whatever was below has now been heard. 1 week later, Halbrook vanished from his home. The door was unlocked. His papers left untouched. But on his desk lay a half-burnt note, the only legible line reading, "The body had no form, but the mouth remained." At the same time in Millstone, the first completed foundation for the new homes experienced a bizarre incident. The concrete sank unusually overnight. Cracks appeared on the floor in the shape of spirals, and all electrical equipment suffered from erratic interference. One of the construction workers, Franco Ramirez, began acting strangely. He talked to himself, dug holes in the ground at night, and constantly wore an old gray cloth draped over his head. A co-worker said, "I saw Franco staring at his shadow for 2 hours. He said, 'It's standing under my feet.' 3 days later, Franco disappeared. Police found his phone and clothes in the woods. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. But on the trunk of a tree a few meters from the scene, someone had carved a circle and inside it a face. No eyes, no mouth. Just raised ridges, as if etched from the opposite side of the bark. From that point on, all construction in Millstone came to a halt. But the Holloway family ignored the warnings. They had already put down a deposit for house number 6 built directly on the eastern plot, where the coffin had been uncovered. And the day they moved in was the same day winter abruptly withdrew. A strange sun hung in the sky. The soil reeked of iron, and the crows no longer circled the forest like usual. They sat frozen on branches, their necks twisted, all facing the same direction, toward the cellar beneath the Holloway home. Asterisk. The Holloway family moved into their new house in early April, on the first full moon after the spring equinox. Both Clive and Maria were independent researchers in the field of ancient architecture. They chose this particular villa because of the old stone foundation beneath it, which gave them a sense of depth. As Clive put it, we're living on memory, not dead earth. They had a 9-year-old daughter named Anna, a gentle, quiet child, sensitive to small sounds, and a former sufferer of infant sleep disorders. Anna was the first to hear the sound coming from beneath the floor. At first, Maria assumed it was an issue with the unfinished plumbing system, but Anna wasn't hearing water. She said clearly, "It's the sound of someone scratching their nails on a wooden lid, but the sound isn't above me. It's beneath me." 4 nights after they moved in, Anna began drawing obsessively. Concentric circles, growing smaller toward the center, and at the end of each drawing was a short cross stroke, like a sealed mouth. She drew them on the walls, on pillows, on bathroom mirrors with steam. All identical. Maria started to worry. She sought out a child psychologist. But when she described the drawings, the specialist, an avowed atheist, went silent for several seconds before asking, "Have you ever heard of a fractured cycle mark?" Maria didn't answer, because she had heard of it during a visit to Kyoto with Clive to study Kuriji Temple, where an old monk once warned her never to touch a red funeral mask with bare hands, especially if the mask had never been properly consecrated. When Maria asked what consecrated meant, the old man replied, "If a mask is not ritually inhabited, it holds no spirit. But if someone inserts their own soul through contact, it will not stay in its form. It will call back, and what comes is not a god, but free memory." Maria never told Clive. That night, when she went down to the cellar to retrieve the heater, she noticed something unusual. Beneath the newly laid cement floor, there was a patch that seemed fractured, as if some force had pushed from underneath. When she approached it, The ground gave slightly under her weight, and for a moment, she clearly saw her own reflection under the concrete ... from the next day onward. Anna no longer ate normally. She insisted on eating under the table, and only in darkness. Every light in the house began flickering at exactly 3:33 and precisely, without fail. Whenever asked about her strange behavior, Anna only replied with one sentence: "I'm not Anna. I'm just remembering for her." Clive, on the other hand, became increasingly enthusiastic. While unpacking, he discovered a hand-drawn architectural sketch hidden behind a wooden wall panel, an illustration of the very house they were living in, but with no front entrance. Each room was connected to a central circle, as if the entire layout was designed as an ancient containment pattern. He didn't tell Maria. Instead, he began renovating the basement, expanding not according to the blueprints, but based on the old drawing. He dug deeper, despite objections. Every strike of the pick felt guided. He dreamed he wasn't digging dirt, but removing the buried mouse. Beneath the cement, he uncovered two small stone pillars buried side by side, each engraved with the same symbol Anna had been drawing. He lifted one of the pillars. Underneath was hollow, and he heard his own voice rising from the pit. "I know this isn't real, but it could be real." Asterisk, after the night Clive unearthed the two stone pillars, every clock in the house stopped working. Not from dead batteries. They simply froze at exactly 2:17 a.m. at the same time. Anna's voice changed. It wasn't just a hoarse tone like a child with a mild illness. It was a kind of echoing resonance, as if she were speaking from inside a cavern, no matter where she was in the house. Maria tried to record it, but on playback, all she heard was the repeated word, keep, keep, keep. Anna no longer called her mom, but used an old word, mower. No one had taught her that. It was a form of Old Norse, closely resembling pre-Christian Icelandic. Clive heard it and smiled faintly, as if everything was unfolding according to plan. He said, "She's remembering. The mask is only a conduit. Memory doesn't die. It waits for a new body." Clive no longer seemed like himself. He spent long hours in the basement, smearing earth on the walls in spiral shapes. He no longer called it the basement. He called it the sleeping tier, the place where memory rests before rebirth. Maria grew increasingly suspicious. She tried to pack up and leave the house, only to find that the front door no longer opened to the outside. When she turned the knob, the door led into a hallway identical to the one inside the house, but not quite right. The painting was crooked. The light didn't flicker. The fan made no sound. Everything looked like a soulless copy. She stepped in. When she turned around, the door was gone. Anna, by contrast, seemed to adapt quickly. She moved from room to room without making a sound, her eyes blinking less frequently, and her mouth barely opening. But on the sixth night after moving in, Maria saw her daughter smiling at the mirror alone. When Maria entered the room, Anna turned to her, and her voice echoed from three directions at once. "I am where memory comes to rest. You are where memory is erased." But, Father? Father is the caller. Maria began digging. In one of Clive's unfinished manuscripts left on his desk, she found a note regarding ancient funeral masks from East Asia. Some archaic soul-calling rituals do not use blood, but employ masks as sound-transmitting vessels. When a mask is separated from the body containing the word, the memory within does not fade. It wanders, seeking the one who opens the mouth. Maria understood. Clive had let the mask listen. And now, it didn't just want to listen, it wanted to speak. That night, Anna disappeared inside the house. Maria tore through every room but couldn't find her. At last, she went down to the basement. The light was dim, the path longer than before. As she stepped into the middle of the room, the walls had changed color from cement gray to a deep blood-like red. Spiral markings now covered every surface. At the center, there was a small figure drawn in charred charcoal, faceless. On the ground sat Anna, back turned. Atop her head, the mask had been placed. Maria rushed forward to pull it off, but Clive's voice stopped her, cold and calm. Don't touch her. She's the vessel now. If you remove it, she'll dissolve. Memory does not forgive those who disrupt the rite. Maria screamed, "This isn't a rite. This is possession." But Anna slowly turned around. Through the mask, her eyes were still open, but they were no longer a child's eyes. They were the eyes of an adult, filled with rage as if imprisoned. For a century, her voice rang out, "No one kept me. I came willingly. I once had a body. And Clive. Clive is the one who dug my grave." Maria froze. The mask hadn't chosen Anna. It remembered. Maria. And Clive, her husband. This wasn't his first time performing the ritual. Asterisk Maria stood frozen. The air around her turned cold, but not the cold of temperature. It was the chill of dead memory. Of things no one was meant to remember. Anna, or whatever inhabited her daughter's form, rose to her feet. The red wooden mask now fused to her face, as if rooted into her skin. Her small hands had grown longer, nails darkened to a deep violet, and her voice no longer came as one. It cracked and layered. A child's tone, a woman's rasp, an old crone's whisper. A feeble man's tremble, all speaking at once. You stood there, Clive. You dug the pit. You set the stakes. You lit the fire while we were still breathing. Clive stumbled back, panic flashing in his eyes for the first time. He shouted, "No! I don't know who you are." "I only excavated. I was researching." "No, Anas." Voice replied, "You weren't researching. You were remembering. We were gagged, bound, pushed to the bottom. You held the rope. You kept us there to keep your secret." Maria stepped forward, grabbing Clive by the shoulders. "What are they saying?" "Clive, who is the person inside our daughter?" Clive trembled. He muttered, I'm not sure. But when I was young, I used to dream of a door made of earth, beneath which dozens of people had no mouths. I heard them screaming ... in my head. I thought it was a nightmare." Maria let go. She whispered, as if confirming it to herself. "Not a nightmare, a returning memory." The basement began to crack, but not in the physical sense. The concrete walls dissolved, revealing ancient stone surfaces carved with raised symbols belonging to no known script. The air thickened like something viscous dripping from the ceiling, each drop a memory that had been murdered. Now seeping back, from every corner, faceless figures emerged, each wearing charred wooden masks, eyeless, mouthless, except their mouths opened inward. They did not approach. They only watched. A chorus echoed from all of them. "It is time to open the mouth. He can't hold it anymore." Anna, or the memory within her, stepped toward Clive. With each footfall, the ground seemed to melt beneath her. She raised her hand and touched his forehead, and in that moment, Clive saw an ancient version of himself, a man dressed in rough hemp robes, skin blackened by fire and smoke, standing above a deep pit, holding a scroll etched with the symbol of the recalent. He was the one who had performed the inverse ritual, where women accused of harboring heretical memories were burned alive. No trial, no burial, no prayers. And Eleanor, the girl Clive first met in a dream while digging, was one. Of them, he remembered it all. Remembered sealing the coffins while they still squirmed inside. Remembered placing the masks without performing the rites, leaving their souls to scream eternally in silence. Clive screamed. Blood poured from his nose. His eyes rolled wildly. I don't want to remember anymore. Please let me forget." Maria whispered, watching her husband. Forgetting is a choice, but now it's time to repay. Anna, her voice fused with something older, deeper, magnetic, placed her hand on Clive's chest. The moment she touched him, his body convulsed, then froze. His eyes rolled back. No scream, no blood. Only a faint exhale, like the breath of surrender. From Clive's chest, a pale mist rose. But it did not disperse. It condensed into a barely human form, which was then surrounded by the masked souls. They merged into it and vanished, as if that had been enough to let them leave. The mask on Anna's face dropped. No sound. She collapsed into Maria's arms, breathing softly. The basement returned to its original state. No stone walls. No blood. Only a solitary stone pillar and a small hollow where the mask had once rested. Clive lay motionless. Not dead, but his eyes were vacant and his mouth no longer opened. Doctors could find no cause. The next day, Maria wrapped the mask in white cloth and reburied it where it had been found. This time, she didn't face it downward. She laid it on its side as if the mask had seen enough. 3 months after the incident. Clive was still alive, but no one called him Clive anymore. In hospital records, he was listed as nonverbal patient, unresponsive to emotional stimuli, capable of self-feeding but does not process language. Referred to his condition as a state of conscious mutism. Another doctor said, "He seems to know who he is. He just doesn't want to be that person anymore." Maria visited him every week. Each time she sat there, Clive would only stare into her eyes without blinking. Sometimes his lips would tremble slightly, as if trying to say something, but no sound came out. And Maria knew it wasn't that he couldn't speak. It was that he wasn't allowed to. Anna had returned to school, but she had changed. She was no longer afraid of the dark. She no longer drew concentric circles. Instead, she began writing a journal in a script no one had taught her, a system of symbols resembling a mix between Old Khmer and Etruscan. Maria once photographed it and sent it to a linguistic expert. They replied, "This script doesn't exist in any known civilization, but the grammar structure feels strangely familiar, as if someone is reconstructing a lost language from memory." One night, Maria awoke to the sound of a door opening, not the front door, the basement door. She followed the sound downstairs. The basement looked unchanged, clean, silent, nothing out of place. But when she switched on the light, she noticed something new, small bulges forming beneath the cement floor. As if something was slowly growing upward, silently but with certainty. On the wall, there was a new drawing. A face with blurred features, closed eyes, and a mouth stretched open, grotesquely wide-reaching all the way to the ears. Beneath it, 3 words written in charcoal: "Old memory wakes." Maria turned to leave, but just as she stepped halfway up the stairs, the light behind her went out. From the darkness came a sound, not a voice, but a breath, cold, heady, like the breath of someone who was buried before they had the chance to scream. A month later, Maria decided to move. They left the house behind. But each night, as Anna slept, she would still whisper in that strange language. Every word slid from her mouth as if pre-written, as though the memory within her didn't need to be relearned, it only needed the right voice to be spoken. Maria didn't stop her. She sat quietly by the child's bedside, sometimes smiling, faintly, not because there was peace, but because no one had to carry the memory alone anymore. Story 3. The Fingers in the Snow. Snow had fallen for 18 consecutive days in Bredsvik, a small town nestled against the northern mountain ranges of Norway. The population was barely 400. No one came in. No one left. The only road out, the E6 highway, had been blocked by snow since the 5th day. In this town, there was an unwritten rule passed down by word of mouth. If you see human handprints in the snow, don't touch them. No one explained why. No one clearly said what had happened. The young dismissed it as a story meant to scare children. The elderly never stepped outside after dark. Even if they heard familiar voices calling from the porch. The Frey family moved there from the south in January of 1983. They were the first outsiders to live in Bredsvik after nearly 20 years without any new residents. The reason for their move was vague. The husband, Henry, was a retired archaeology teacher, forced to stop working early after an accident in Estonia. His wife, Claire, was once a stone sculptor, now suffering from memory loss and uncontrollable impulsive behavior. Their daughter, Eleanor, 17, quiet and withdrawn, had undergone treatment for a condition described as involuntary memory loops, unable to distinguish real from unreal. The house they rented sat near the forest edge, just below a small hill. At the top of that hill stood a nameless gray stone monolith, known by locals as Grave Rock. No one dared touch it. On the 9th day of snow, Eleanor, left the house. At dawn, she walked to the hilltop, despite the outdoor temperature being minus 24 degrees. When she returned, she said nothing. She simply wrote 3 words on paper in Old Norse. Flesh remembers still. That evening, Henry was reading when he heard a soft scratching sound outside the window. He assumed it was a tree branch, but when he approached, he saw 5 handprints on the glass thin, unnaturally long fingers, like those of a frail woman. What was strange was, there were no footprints in the snow outside, no drag marks leading away. And when he opened the door, the handprints were still there, inside the pane, as if they had grown from the glass itself. He tried to wipe them away, but they wouldn't come off. Claire, watching from another room, simply said, "They're looking for what's missing." On the 12th day of snow, Claire began waking at 3:11 a.m. each night, walking around the house, touching every cold surface, stone walls, the sink, the window panes. When Henry asked why, she only smiled, tears in her eyes. "I used to carve their faces, but I don't remember who they were anymore." Henry started seeing fingers pushing through the snow in daylight, not imprints emerging, like roots. As if beneath the snow were the living, not the dead. He tried speaking to Eleanor, but she wouldn't respond. She sat facing the corner, her room clutching her head, whispering the same phrase over and over. "She's chewing. She's still chewing." Asterisk that night. Snow stopped falling for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Henry stepped out into the backyard. Everything was blanketed in white, but under the moonlight, something strange became visible. Dozens of hands protruded from the snow. They weren't random. They were arranged in a circle, fingers all pointing inward, as if forming a sigil. At the center of the ring of hands lay something pitch black, half buried. Henry dug it out. It was a fragment of a jawbone, not whole, but with a few teeth still clinging to it. He was about to throw it away when Claire ran out from the house, screaming, "No!" "Don't separate it from the circle." She collapsed into the snow and hurriedly brushed white powder back over the bone. As if burying something that needed to stay forgotten, Henry began digging into the town's records. At the public library, an elderly librarian handed him an unsigned handwritten note hidden among old maps. It read, "In 1839, after an unusually long winter, 27 women in the village were executed for the crime of calling snow. There was no trial, no defense. Only one ritual: burial alive in snow, so that their tongues would melt in the cold. Their hands were bound, stones stuffed into their mouths, and a carved stone finger was placed on each tongue. They were buried standing up, so their heads remained above the ground, then packed over with heavy snow until no sound could be heard. After the ritual, Brunswick was spared. But from then on, whenever the snow fell for too long, the fingers returned to reclaim mouths severed from their final words." Henry paused at the last line. Only when someone carves their exact faces and replaces the jawbone in the correct place can they be released. He looked at Claire. Broken fragments of memory came rushing back. Claire had once sculpted stone for archaeological projects. But there was one thing he had never fully believed. In trances, she would draw faces of people she had never met, with disturbing detail wrinkles near the temples, eyes slightly off-center, lips torn as if something had been forced inside. They had once argued over a female face she sculpted while half asleep, a face identical to that of an undisclosed Egyptian mummy they had never even visited. Henry didn't understand then. But now he suspected Claire hadn't lost her memory. She was being forced to remember the faces of those who had their mouths taken away. Eleanor spoke less and less, not out of fear, but as if she were learning how to listen. The fingers emerging from the snow didn't scare her. She sat among them in silence, listening with her palms, placing her hands upon theirs. Then, closing her eyes, one night, she whispered to Henry, "Dad, Mom was the last person to see them. Before they were buried. You were the first to unearth a piece of them. And me, I'm the tongue they're borrowing back." Henry shuddered. "What are you saying?" Eleanor turned to him, her eyes wide. "I don't know my name. I'm not sure I'm Eleanor. But I know. Someone once had that name, and she was never allowed to say her final words. The next morning, Henry found a sculpture of snow at the foot of the bed, already starting to melt. It was a woman's face. The features were unclear, but the eye sockets were deeply sunken, and the mouth was carved open, so wide it reached the ears. Inside the mouth sat a piece of jawbone, the very one he had dug up days before, now resting exactly where it belonged. Beneath the sculpture, someone had written, 1/27th has been released. Asterisk 2/27th has been released. Those words appeared on the kitchen floor in the early morning. Written in ice, unmelted, each letter seemed to grow out of the stone. Henry understood. Every face Claire carved, every bone fragment he unearthed, every phrase Eleanor whispered, all were part of a ritual being reenacted, one that could not be stopped. On the 15th day after the first snowfall, a wooden coffin about 6 feet long appeared inside the house, placed directly in front of a window no one had opened. No one saw who brought it. On the lid, a handwritten message. Don't bury anyone else. They haven't all left yet. Claire began sculpting unconsciously. Each time she awoke, her hands were covered in chisel wounds, dry blood mixed with stone, dust under her nails. But she didn't stop. One night, she carved 5 faces, none of them had mouths. With each finished face, a door somewhere in town opened by itself and would no longer close. People in Bretsvik began to disappear. No screamed. No blood. They were simply no longer in their homes. Beds still warm, food still hot. But no footprints could be found. Henry went to the police station. The only person still there was an old man with one blind eye named Ragnar, known in the village as the doorkeeper. Ragnar sat motionless, as if he'd been waiting for Henry. When he heard Claire's name, he nodded. She was here once. Therefore she was Claire, before this town even had a name. Henry didn't understand. Ragnar pulled open a drawer and took out an old, yellowed photograph. A woman stood before a stone table, chisel in hand. Her face matched Claire's exactly, down to the smallest detail. But the photo was worn and dated 1917. She was the first face carver. She sculpted the murdered, so they could rest. But someone ... interrupted the ritual. And ever since, with every cycle of snow, she's called back, to remember, to redo. Henry asked, trembling, so ... Our coming here, was it random, or... Ragnar cut him off, his gaze fixed on the snow falling outside the window. You didn't come here. They called you. That night, Eleanor was no longer. She sat in the middle of the ring of hands, eyes closed but mouth open, speaking in the voices of others, not one, but many, like a buried choir beneath the ground. We weren't silenced because we sinned. We were silenced because we remembered what others wanted to forget. With every verse Eleanor finished, a patch of snow in the yard melted, and Henry saw them, bodies standing upright, buried vertically, heads still held high, and faces fully. Carved once more. When Claire completed the 13th face, she suddenly stopped. Her hands trembled. Staring at the unfinished stone, she whispered, "This face, I can single quotes ... it's mine." Henry rushed over. The carving was Claire's, but younger eyes swollen with tears, mouth stuffed with stone, blood running from the nostrils, chin torn open, as if she had tried to scream while being buried. Claire screamed, stumbling back, unraveling. I was the 14th. The house began to tremble faintly. Eleanor raised her head and looked at her mother. She whispered in a voice that was not her own, "You never completed the ritual. They won't forgive you, but I will do it for you." Henry now understood. Claire had been one of the 27 women buried alive, but she had survived by breaking the ritual, escaping, changing her name, changing her identity, and living multiple lives until memory found her body once again. Eleanor was the borrowed tongue because the voices of the silence needed a living throat to speak. 14/27s have been released. The message appeared on the ceiling, scratched into the wood by fingernails, and outside the snow began to melt. But only around their house. The rest of Bretsvik remained frozen, still and pale, like a shroud concealing a forgotten cemeteries. 2027s have been released. Henry no longer knew what time it was. Every clock in the house had stopped at 3:11 a.m. Our Claire began carving each night. In town, there were no more living people. Empty houses, open doors, broken windows, but no signs of theft or forced entry. It was as if the entire population of Bretsvik had chosen to disappear. Claire began sculpting her own face. She said nothing, gave no explanation. She only nodded when Eleanor placed the stone block before her. Her hands trembled slightly, but each chisel strike was flawless. High cheekbones, tear-blurred eyes, and the mouth stuffed with a stone fixed in a final expression, screaming with no one to hear. Henry tried to stop her, but Eleanor stood between him and her mother, whispering in 3-layered voices, "You can keep her for one more season of snow, but each year more will be taken. Do you choose to keep her, or to bury the count along with him?" Ragnar, the doorkeeper, came to them one last time. He said nothing, only handed Henry a piece of jawbone still crusted with frozen moss. Etched into it were 3 Old Norse runes, roughly translated as the root of betrayal. Ragnar spoke, voice dry, like ancient parchment. The one who carries this bone must place it into their own mouth. Otherwise, the ritual is just the repetition of blasphemy. Memory is not to be carved in stone. It must be swallowed into flesh. Henry fell silent. They needed a volunteer to carry the memory of those unjust deaths alive and remembering. Forever, no more would die. But whoever accepted this would no longer be themselves. That night, Eleanor stopped speaking. She sat in the yard, snow melting beneath her, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the single red star in the sky. Claire approached. She handed her daughter the sculpture of her own face and kissed her forehead, light as ash. "You are not the one who must keep the memories. I am the one who left when they needed me most." Henry looked at the 2 women before him, one who had been the wife he loved all his life, the other, daughter who might no longer be entirely his. He nodded. The ritual took place within the circle of hands. Each hand pointed toward the center, where Claire sat, and placed the stone likeness of her face over her chest. Eleanor stood behind her. Ragnar held the jawbone. Henry, the only one who had never carved, spoke. "I don't know how to offer salvation, but I accept the burden of remembering what others tried to bury." He held out his hand. Ragnar placed the jawbone into it, then turned away. Henry placed the bone into his mouth, like planting a seed. A stabbing cold shot down his spine. Blood dripped, but no scream came. Eleanor helped her mother lie down. Claire did not gasp, did not struggle. She only smiled softly. And for the first time in hundreds of years, she spoke the words never allowed to be finished. "I did not summon the snow. I only remembered the ones who were lost." The wind stopped. The forest stood still. In the sky, the snowfall ceased. But this time, not because the season ended, but because all the dead had gone. The next morning, Henry woke alone. Claire had dissolved like snow. Eleanor slept beside him, head resting on his shoulder, eyes open, but no other voices spoke from within her. Only her dot in the wind. No more fingers reached from the ground. Etched into the soil, this time written in warm ash. 2727s have been released. A new memory keeper has been born. Asterisk, the snow melted in early March, no longer suddenly, no longer painfully, as if even the earth had stopped holding on to the resentment of centuries past. The Frey family was no longer whole. Claire was gone, but she left no body, no statue. Only 27 faces remained, placed around the forest edge and a broken arc, facing one another as if whispering a story repeated for hundreds of years. Eleanor returned to school. Her classmates asked where she had been all winter. She only smiled, a faint smile, slightly crooked to the left, as if once touched by a blade. She no longer heard voices in her head, but occasionally sitting alone in class, she would write lines of poetry in Old Norse with her left hand, using a script no one could recognize. One night, Henry secretly looked through a notebook. He saw the same lines written over and over. I am no longer myself, but the other has found peace. What is swallowed is not lost, only waiting for another tongue to speak again. The mouth has paid. The tongue remains. Henry stayed in Brunswick for another year, as if needing to remain until some unnamed event could pass. He no longer heard voices in the house, no more hands rising through the snow. But on some dusky afternoons, standing by the window, he noticed new chisel. Marks on stone statues, marks he was certain hadn't been there the day before. One night, he heard tapping from the forest, a rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried underground. Not a ghost, not the living, but someone still carving an unfinished face, one not yet remembered dot in the second year. He left. Before departing, he buried an incomplete statue, only the upper half, of a face right in the center of the old circle of hands. No marking, no dedication, no memory to cling to. Only a gesture to keep memory from rooting too deep got 15 years later. A group of archaeology students passed through Brunswick, a place once buried by snow for seasons at a time. In their expedition journal, they wrote, "No people, no records, only forest, stone faces, and wind that breathes like someone trying to finish a sentence they were never allowed to speak." One girl in our group said she saw a hand rising from the snow. But when we dug, we found only a small stone, carved delicately with the shape of a fingernail. No one knows who restored the stone faces, or why they always gaze into the forest. No one knows why every time the snow falls, a line of poetry appears in the snow, written in unerasable script. Carve me again, before someone forgets me. Story 4. Faceless stone statue. The wind tore through the cracks of the 19th century wooden house, making a sound like someone hissing through clenched teeth every time night fell. The town of Craymore, Minnesota, hadn't seen outsiders in nearly 2 decades. Even maps had begun to omit its name. But beneath the snow and forgotten swanlands, something was still breathing. Arthur Garvin, an anthropology lecturer at a university in Chicago, had no reason to visit Craymore except for the item that arrived in an unmarked package, a faceless wooden statue, old and stained with dried blood at its base, accompanied by a handwritten note. Wrong offering, cursed for life. Arthur was used to hoaxes from students and fringe groups in archaeology. But the uneven scrawl on the note reminded him of old land covenants written by the illiterate. And the blood wasn't paint, he knew the darkened color of aged hemoglobin. After several sleepless nights, Arthur uncovered that Craymore was once home to a 19th century isolationist cult that worshipped a faceless god through nameless. Rituals of forbiddance rite with roots in East Asia, only ever found in archaeological fragments, tied to ancient beliefs from Manchuria and the Ryukyu Islands. So why had such an artifact appeared in the middle of America? He arrived in Craymore on a foggy October morning, with mist clinging to the windshield and trees twisting as if hiding something. The town was abandoned, yet the roads were clear. Some houses showed signs of recent repair. More unsettling, no electricity, but every house had a single, half-burnt candle still glowing. Arthur had told no one of this trip. But as soon as he placed the statue on the desk of his rented house, the phone rang despite no signal. Don't say its name, don't look at the face. If you still see a face, the voice was old, distorted, distant like a recording from a broken cassette. Before he could respond, the call dropped. No caller ID, no record of the call. That first night, Arthur heard footsteps circling the house. Wood creaked like nails dragging lightly across the floor. The windows fogged from the outside, and a blackened handprint appeared on the glass, as if made of ash and soot. But with no fingerprint ridges, the wooden statue on his desk didn't look the same as it had by daylight. He was sure it had. No mouth. But now, by candlelight, a thin crack had formed like tightly sealed lips just beginning to part. And when he leaned in, a foul, coppery stench leaked from within, as though something inside the wood was rotting, Arthur stayed up all night, staring at the statue, waiting for it to move. It didn't. It just sat there still, heavy, waiting, as if longing to be named again. The next day, Arthur met the only person still alive in Craymore, an old woman named Madeline who lived near the old cemetery. Her skin was gray, her eyes deeply set, and she always wore gloves even indoors. Madeline stared at Arthur for a long time before speaking. "I thought you'd taken it away. But you brought it back. We were wrong. Not once, but for 3 generations." Arthur asked about the statue. Madeline pointed toward the trees, swaying in the wind. They used to offer it the pinky finger of a newborn, not as a gift, but so it would remember the scent of blood. But the last generation had no children. They used the blood of ... the dying. That was wrong, deeply wrong. When Arthur asked who had sent him the statue, she simply said, "Anyone still alive." Still, wants forgiveness. On the 3rd night, Arthur took a photo of the statue with his phone. The image showed the face of an old man, no whites in his eyes, lips sealed, nose and cheekbones clearly formed. But in reality, the statue was still faceless. He tried filming a video. In the 8-second clip, the statue blinked twice. When he played it back, the footage was corrupted. All that remained was a low hum, like wind in a furnace flue, and a raspy breath like the last exhale of a hanged man. On the 4th night, Arthur experienced sleep paralysis. When he opened his eyes, a faceless man in an ancient ceremonial robe stood at the foot of his bed, holding a wooden bowl. The man offered it to him. Inside was a pinky finger still warm, slick with fresh blood. Arthur awoke at 3:33 a.m., his hands stained with real blood. But there were no cuts on his body. He checked the statue. The mouth crack had opened wider. And for the first time in his life, Arthur felt it. Breathing. Asterisk. Night. Arthur couldn't sleep. He just sat motionless in front of the statue, watching every crack under the candlelight light, dim enough to awaken something that had been asleep. The statue now smelled of raw flesh. That faint scent, found in morgues, and the musty tongue of blood dried in hair. Arthur brought it into the bathroom, placed it on the sink, and gently sliced the crack of the mouth with a knife. The wood wasn't as hard as it should have been. It was soft, almost like skin. A light cut released a dark, sticky fluid that oozed out like thick pus. He backed away. His heart didn't race, but his hands trembled as if holding something filthy that couldn't be washed clean. Suddenly, he remembered last night's dream, the faceless man with the wooden bowl standing under his bed. Arthur turned on his computer. A news article he had never searched for was open in the browser. An old faded scan dated 1983, town of Craymore. 43 disappeared during full moon night. Only ash circle and faceless statue left behind. He zoomed in on the accompanying photo. In the ashes was a wooden bowl and a small finger, blackened and curled, as if still in pain. Arthur went to see Madeline, but her house was locked. No footprints in the snow. The door was sealed with crisscrossed white ribbons and East Asian ritual binding. Hanging from the doorknob was a cloth folded into the shape of a face. No eyes, no nose. Tied around its neck was a scrap of paper with black ink. Face must not be named. The 3rd time will not forgive. He brought the cloth back along with the statue. For reasons he didn't understand, he began speaking to the statue. Not like someone delusional, but as if being drawn in his mind, forming questions on its own. Were you once a person? Did they sacrifice someone to you? Why the pinky finger? He didn't wait for answers. But every time he looked away, the statue shifted slightly, its hands curled in. Its body tilted toward him, and the crack in the mouth widened just a bit more. Night 5. He found himself sleeping in the basement. He didn't remember going down, but his arms were wrapped around the statue like cradling a child. The walls around the room had claw marks, bloody fingernail trails. On the table was a charcoal sketch of the faceless man in ritual robes. But what froze Arthur was this. The erased face in the drawing was identical to one He had drawn as a child. Arthur had once sketched an imaginary friend at 6 years old. A tall man, a long robe, no face, holding a wooden bowl, always standing at the foot of his bed. His parents had burned the drawing. After he suffered insomnia for 8 months and mumbled about the smell of blood in the dark. He had undergone hypnosis therapy. They said it was childhood trauma. But now the figure had returned, exactly as it was, in a town he'd never visited, in a ritual he'd never heard of. Day 6. Arthur didn't eat or drink, but his body showed no fatigue. He began hearing rhythmic knocks from the statue, not actual sound, but an internal echo-like vibrations rising from the depths of his skull. Madeline left a letter at his doorstep. You need to leave. You are not of Craymore. It only chooses bloodlines that once made promises. But if you dreamt of the wooden bowl ritual, then it has already tasted your memory. You can still run, but don't take it with you. If you cross Craymore's border with that statue, everyone near you will die first. It will make them your replacements. Arthur didn't take the statue with him, but he couldn't leave Craymore either. GPS maps lost signal. His car wouldn't start. Snow fell endlessly, sealing every possible way out. And on the 6th night, Arthur heard the sound of a child crying from the basement where he had once slept. The crying repeated exactly 3 times, pausing every 33 seconds. It went on for 3 hours. He descended with a flashlight. The beam hit the dirt wall, and there he saw a second statue. Identical to the first, except it had a face. It was his face. Eyes shut, lips tight, arched nose, a faint scar under the cheek. Every detail was exact. This statue bore no blood. But carved around the neck was a single line in ancient Manchu script, a language Arthur had studied long ago. Soul. Replacement. Arthur no longer felt hunger. His body still moved, still wrote, still walked, but his consciousness drifted somewhere behind himself. Strange memories began to creep into his dreams. He saw himself in a bizarre festival, not as a spectator, but as the OFF-I-T-N-T dot in his hand was a red wooden bowl, stained with blood up to the rim. Surrounding him were children, bound and gagged with ash-soaked mud and dry maple leaves. The adults stood in a circle, hands hidden beneath robes, expressionless. After each time the bowl was filled, a finger was severed. He woke with a red cut. On his pinky finger, blood seeped out, but faintly, as if drained from the veins. At that point, Arthur tried to destroy both statues. He placed them in the fireplace, doused them with gasoline, and lit a match. The fire didn't catch. Smoke rose, gray and thick, with the acrid scent of burnt flesh. A sudden dizziness struck him like a hammer to the skull, and he collapsed, unconscious for nearly 6 hours. When he woke, the statues were still there, but the one with a face had changed. Its eyes were open, staring directly at him. On its forehead was a new inscription, carved into the soft wood with a fingernail. You remember now? Arthur began digging through his family records. He had never considered any connection to the Craymore region. It was just a random place he'd chosen to escape the city. But in an old photo left by his father, he found a portrait of a man in ceremonial robes, standing behind a faceless statue, and a 7-branch candle. Beneath the photo, a handwritten note read, Sebastian Garvin, minus 1,894, last bearer of the ritual. Arthur trembled. Garvin. His full name was Arthur Garvin. This couldn't be coincidence. He called his mother, long estranged, to ask about their family's origins. Her voice wavered beneath background static. Don't go back there, Arthur. That's not our home. That's where they used blood to bargain for something. Your father broke the last circle. But if you've seen the statue, if it's opened its eyes, then you've already been chosen. Arthur asked, who are they? His mother only replied, they're not people anymore. Not human. They're the bodies that refuse to be forgotten. And you're the last living vein they have left in this world. That night, every mirror in the house cracked. The bathroom mirror shattered without impact. On each shard, A room reflected one that didn't exist in his house. Its walls were matted with human hair. The floor was soaked in blood. The second statue, his own face, was no longer still. It moved. Changed positions on its own. Arthur caught it on camera. The footage showed the statue rising to its feet, walking to where Arthur slept, then sitting beside his bed, eyes unblinking. Outside, the snow fell heavier and faster. Arthur decided to walk to the old Craymore cemetery for answers. He remembered seeing it in a dream, the place where the 43 who vanished had been buried together. Without headstones, in the center of the cemetery, he found a small pit filled with ash, covered by untouched snow. He knelt, brushed away the cold soil, and pulled up a piece of wooden plank, carved into it, Elizabeth G. Beneath that, the words, "the first child born without a face." Arthur understood. The faceless statues weren't just symbols. They were forms stripped away, bodies sealed. Real people. Elizabeth could have been his great-aunt. A child, sacrificed, or one who survived and became the vessel for a curse. When he returned, the house had no windows. The walls were coated in ash. The Arthur face statue sat in the center of the living room, holding the drawing he'd made as a child of the faceless man. On the painting, written in blood, a new brushstroke had been added, a figure of Arthur himself standing beside. The faceless man, he too, now faceless. Asterisk, that night, Arthur couldn't sleep. The mirrors were gone from the house, but reflective surfaces remained. The water in the sink, the glass of the fireplace, the shell of the computer monitor. And in each of them, his reflection no longer matched. He touched his face. His eyes were there, his lips too. But the reflection lagged half a second behind him. Its mouth didn't move when he screamed. Just then, a small shard of mirror fell from the bookshelf. Not from any disturbance. As if something resisted Arthur's attempt to forget, he picked it up and dragged it across his wrist. Blood flowed, but in the reflection, his copy didn't bleed. It simply stood still, staring at him, then slowly raised one finger signaling silence. Arthur stepped outside, blood still seeping, snow staining his coat. He turned to the old cemetery, following a mental map from his childhood drawings. The final location, behind a row of broken headstones, a sunken door beneath a round stone slab. No handle, only an inscription. Mirror is face, face is blood. Blood repays mirror. Beneath the snow, Arthur clawed with his fingernails. The layers of stone cracked away, revealing a spiral-shaped crypt, a path descending into darkness. Lit a candle and stepped in. The corridor held no coffins, only statues sitting against the wall, each faceless. Hands raised to shield their eyes, as if avoiding his gaze. At the end of the passage was the mirror room for massive mirrors, facing one another, forming a chamber of infinite reflection. In the center stood a red wooden bowl atop a stone pedestal. Inside the bowl, a single human eye, still fresh. Arthur leaned over, and the mirrors began to speak. Not with sound, but with images he could not control. Mirror 1, it showed Arthur strangling a young girl, her face obscured, but the bloodied dress and tangled hair were disturbingly real. He screamed, denying it, but in the mirror his hands only tightened. Mirror 2 reflected one of his own dreams. But this time, Arthur was the one bound, not the efficient. A strange hand poured blood onto his head, and the faceless statue smiled with an invisible grin. Mirror 3 played the moment of his birth. His mother giving birth not in a hospital, but in a wooden room lit by candlelight. A man in ceremonial robes cut the umbilical cord with a stone knife, muttering a chant. That man was Sebastian Garvin. Mirror 4, pure black. But as Arthur stepped closer, his reflection vanished, completely replaced by the faceless man in ash-gray robes, standing in the cemetery, tilting the blood-filled bowl back toward the earth. From somewhere, nowhere, voice echoed, genderless, placeless. Each life, one child. Each child, one face. You are the mirror that must never be wiped clean. Now choose. The final one or the next. Arthur trembled. He turned to flee, but the stone door had vanished. The only exit was the fourth mirror, now open wide, reflecting. Not the present, but a place outside of time. He jumped in. When he awoke, Arthur found himself back inside a house in daylight, but everything was wrong. The calendar read 1912. Outside the window, Cramore's townspeople walked in black, wearing mourning hats, marching toward the cemetery. In each hand, a mirror wrapped in red cloth. Arthur understood he had been pulled into the sacrificial cycle to become either the offering or the next officiant. But then he looked down at his hands. No cut, no blood dot, and in the house's mirror, his reflection was that of a middle-aged man. Not himself. A small girl knocked at the door. She handed him an envelope. "Auntie said you forgot your name. This is for you." Inside was a photo of Arthur himself, dressed in ceremonial robes. On the back, handwritten, "Welcome back, Sebastian." Asterisk Arthur. Couldn't remember the moment he'd put on the ceremonial robe again, standing amidst a funeral procession for no one dead. No casket, no mourning cries. Only mirrors covered in red silk, carried solemnly by townspeople, one by one, none of them meeting his gaze. A young woman passed by and placed a wooden mask in his hand, featureless, carved smooth with no eyes, no nose. The mask was old, a crack at the corner stained deep with dried blood. She whispered, "The one who holds the mirror must be faceless. The one with a face must shatter the mirror." Then she vanished into the procession, as if dissolving into smoke. In the temple beneath the cemetery, Arthur once again stood before the offering statue. But this time he saw nothing of himself. No mirror reflected him, as if his very soul had dispersed into stone, into earth, into something more primal than a name. The blood-stained wooden bowl still sat at the center of the room. Inside it now lay a damp, rotting piece of parchment, written in a language long extinct, but Arthur, or Sebastian, could read it. As if it had been written by his own hand. One mirror spills blood, one face is born. One reflection, one life forgotten. When the mirror breaks, only the eye remembers. He sat. The blood from his hand, now without a pulse, dripped steadily into the bowl. The faceless statue trembled. Then, from its hands, a new mask fell. This time, the mask had eyes, but no mouth. Arthur understood. Death was not an escape. Since his ancestor, the first Sebastian, the family had upheld a ritual of no face in each generation. One would bear the burden of the mirror, of seeing what others refused to see. The price was the loss of self. He stepped into the center of the chamber and placed the mask onto the fourth mirror. The mirror shattered into 100 fragments, but not one piece reflected his face. The stone statue rose, but it did not strike. It knelt, lowered its head, as if surrendering its role, as if recognizing the final seer had arrived. Arthur, no longer Arthur, placed the mouthless mask upon his face. All sound vanished. His heart stopped beating. Eyes opened, and he saw everything. He saw the children sacrificed in ages past. He saw every mirror recording every generation's spilled blood. He saw himself repeated across eras, bearing different names, different faces, always returning to this place. And he saw the future. No one else to succeed him, no one left to carry the burden. The stone statue stood and slowly receded into the dark. The chamber crumbled. The mirrors burned in flames cold as frost. The wooden bowl cracked. The blood inside hardened, turning into black crystal. Arthur did not die. He became the third statue, beside the two older ones, the first faceless and the one in between. From now on, the mirrors are full. No faces left to reflect. No names left to remember. The cycle ends in emptiness.